I'm Nala Ayed. Welcome to Ideas, and to the fifth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, by world-renowned internet communications and security expert Ron Deibert. We've got a problem. The internet, the great tool that was supposed to put information at everyone's fingertips and make the world a whole lot better, has been taken over by forces that seem beyond our control. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert explores what went wrong and what we might do about it. Ron Deibert is director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, a research group that focuses on digital threats to human rights and civil society. They've investigated cyber attacks against Mexican journalists, disinformation spread by Iran, and the hacking of the Democratic Party emails in 2016. In his 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Ron Deibert ranges over many of the issues that plague the internet and social media. The latest insights into the psychology of marketing and the hacking of human behavior are being used to turn us into addicts. Our personal data is being vacuumed up, turning us all into products for sale. Governments in general and malign players in particular are using social media tools against us as a weapon. And the question is, what is to be done? There's no Massey Lectures tour this year, but we've assembled a panel to comment on what Ron Deibert is talking about. Some of the people you'll hear from time to time through the programs are writer and filmmaker Astra Taylor, human rights lawyer Chinmayi Arun, philosophy professor Tamsin Shah, journalist and author Misha Glenny, former Google executive Meredith Whittaker, journalist and author John Naughton, and political scientist Daniel Dewdney. On Ideas, here's Ron Deibert with the fifth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures.
This is Lecture 5, Burning Data. Part 1, The Delhi Paradigm. October 2019. I arrive in Delhi, India, and as I always do when traveling abroad, I spend my first day walking the streets to shake off jet lag. Delhi is a microcosm of all of the themes that I've been talking about. Social media use is skyrocketing. Everywhere I look, someone has a mobile device in their hand. Many people have several. There are countless advertisements for low-cost wireless plans. But India also exhibits all of the downsides, unintended consequences, and negative externalities of social media. Like those in many other countries, Indian authorities have rolled out technologically enhanced surveillance and other information controls. Upon arrival at the airport, I, along with other travelers, submit to a biometric scanning system. India has implemented the world's largest biometric identification program called Aadhaar, but it is riddled with privacy and security problems. As in just about every other country to which I travel, CCTV cameras are seemingly everywhere, though it's hard to tell whether they're functional or not. While these concerns are all uppermost in my mind as I begin my first day in Delhi, there's something else that is too overpowering to ignore: the noxious air. Delhi has recently overtaken Beijing as the most polluted capital city in the world. It is often said that Westerners visiting India are overwhelmed by the sights and sounds, especially the incessantly loud backdrop of vehicle horns. Cars, buses, taxis, scooters, and auto rickshaws, all jockeying for position while signaling to each other via a symphony of incessant honks, toots, and beeps. But what is most in your face, what is most instantly overwhelming on my first day, is that it's difficult and unpleasant to breathe. The pollution in Delhi is like nowhere else on earth, literally. Strolling through Delhi's neighborhoods, it's hard to believe that the energy system works at all. Alongside crumbling concrete buildings and mud-filled, crowded, dusty streets, one thing stands out: seemingly endless coils of electrical wires and fiber optic cables bunched together like tangled spaghetti. Cables of all shapes and sizes droop over balconies, are bound together with string alongside makeshift telephone poles, are strung over the middle of streets, or in some places just hang low and splayed out over the sidewalk or drooping through puddles of mud and filth. Dotting the top of nearly every one of those concrete buildings are cell arrays, satellite dishes, and other antennae packed around one another, some pointing in this direction and others that. Nearly everyone is frantically swiping or texting as they shout and bump into each other in a street dance of congestion and mobile connectivity. The combination of poverty, packs of stray dogs, cows roaming the streets, and litter everywhere, alongside spools of electrical wire, cables, and DIY cell towers, makes for something out of a William Gibson novel. I pick my way through a semi-complete but abandoned construction site that serves as a shortcut to my hotel, carefully avoiding potentially dangerous exposed cables and wires, and then stop, frozen in my tracks at a railway overpass, in awe of the sight below me. The longest possible train I could have imagined, with open wagons full to the brim of coal. It seems like several minutes go by as the train passes underneath me, one coal-filled wagon after another, heading directly into the orange mist of the late afternoon horizon, an orange mist that seems to coat all of Delhi like toxic candy floss. Virtual, ethereal, weightless, clean, futuristic. These and other terms like them are what first comes to mind for most people when they think of digital technologies. But the reality is far different. As long as I've studied information and communications technologies, I've been fascinated by its often overlooked but vast and inescapable physical infrastructure. No doubt my fascination is thanks to the influence of media ecologists like Harold Innis and Marshall McLuhan, whose contributions to the field were distinguished by their appreciation of communications technology's material qualities. I've studied undersea fiber optic cables, toured landing stations off the east coast of Africa, and descended into the depths of a mountain-encased data center that once served as a nuclear fallout shelter in Stockholm, Sweden. Friends and family poke fun at my obsession with cell towers, which I photograph and share on social media, usually accompanied with a nerdy explanation of how they comprise part of the overlooked underbelly of cyberspace. Most users either ignore or take for granted this vast physical ecosystem. The electrical wires, power lines, cell towers, and satellite dishes are now simply part of the taken-for-granted surroundings, so common and pervasive that they simply fade into the background. But even if some elements are hard to ignore, as with Delhi's endless mesh of cables, dishes, and towers, they only show part of the picture. Much of the materiality of social media is either hidden from view or difficult for the average person to experience firsthand, at least not without some effort. For much of our day-to-day lives, we are presented instead with a kind of technological mirage. Our consumption of social media and the communications ecosystem as a whole that supports them generates a kind of hidden tax on the natural environment that we don't feel, see, smell, or touch as we blithely swipe away at a text or tweet. But it's there and growing. It generates a full spectrum of strains on the natural world, from the mining and manufacturing through to the energy consumption and waste. As we grow further and further dependent on social media and its seemingly never-ending universe of consumer electronics, we devour ever larger quantities of energy and strain the planet's finite pool of natural resources. Although for a long time the topic was poorly studied, a small but growing number of scholars are beginning to recognize the fourth painful truth about social media and our communications ecosystem as a whole. They are contributing to massive environmental degradation.
This is Astra. All bits of data are actually carried along by atoms. The digital world is not immaterial. And in this sense, the metaphor of the cloud has been so misleading, right? One other thing I think we need to be more angry about as consumers is the fact of planned obsolescence. The fact that the devices we make are made to break so that we have to buy new ones, right? Every new iPhone, we have to upgrade it. Our devices are not interoperable. They're not made to work together. This locks us into buying more and more stuff that is, incredibly hard to recycle and is toxic for communities. So, I wish that we would have an outlaw obsolescence campaign. You should not be able to make things to break as part of your business model to boost your profits. You should actually make things that are long lasting, that are quality, and users should have a right to repair. We should have the right as users to have devices that we can fix and that then we care for because this is stuff that is ultimately rare and precious, and we should treat it as such instead of, treating it as disposable, which is what we do at the moment.
Hello, this is Chinmay Arun. What Ron is saying today really impacts me, but it's not just because of what I missed about the fact that my multiple devices come with a cost to this earth, but also that he uses as a metaphor the specific global south city in which I lived and worked and set up an information policy center that actually never engaged with this very valuable question that he raises, that it has a physical cost, and that physical cost is borne mainly by global south cities. And so it goes to places in which the rules about what you can do to the environment and what you can do to people are lax. And the society and the earth itself can be exploited in ways in which would never be permitted in the Silicon Valley in which these decisions are made. It's important to take stock not only of the fact that the detrimental effects of the technology that we use are more vast than we can contemplate and will probably have more permanent physical effect than we can contemplate, but also that this harm takes place in places that we may never visit and will actually be suffered by people that we will never meet.
Part 2. Manufacturing Hell. Let's go back to that device you hold in your hand and take another close look. Have you ever stopped to contemplate how it's manufactured? Have you paused to consider all of the various elements that make it up? Most of us simply take it for granted, the slender, solid piece of electronics we carry around with us at all times, until it stops functioning, that is. We then discard it for an upgrade, our junk drawers littered with electronic relics and their assorted, unpackaged peripherals. It's not just that we take it for granted. We are also actively discouraged from peering inside that device. That smartphone you hold in your hand is what's known in engineering as a black box. You can observe its inputs and outputs, but its inner workings are largely a mystery to all but a select few. Part of the reason has to do with planned obsolescence, a syndrome inherent to consumer culture. Our gadgets are built by design not to last. The sooner they stop working, the more likely you'll want an upgrade to a more recent version. And when you do, you'll need some accessories and peripherals too, or you won't be able to enjoy all of the new features. Raise your hand if you have a Tupperware bin full of discarded cables, attachments, dongles, and adapters. But part of it is also cultural. The less users know what goes on beneath the surface of the social media environment, the better for the industry that serves it up. Generally speaking, tech companies want us to focus on the virtual and ethereal layers, the compelling content that keeps us all hooked. They do not want us to observe the messy subterranean realm that keeps it all functioning. What if you were encouraged to look inside? What would you find? It's astonishing to reflect on how something so small could perform such complex calculations. As we pull it apart and examine it, there is the LED display, the touchscreen, the camera lens, the modem, the SIM card, the microprocessing chips, the circuits, and the lithium-ion battery. Even if we were to strip it down to its bare essentials and lay them out on the desk, we would still not be able to fully appreciate the material shadow that is cast by such a small thing. The production of each and every device involves hundreds of kilograms of fossil fuels, dozens of kilograms of chemicals, and thousands of kilograms of water. The data centers that process all those videos, documents, and emails consume hundreds of thousands of gallons of fresh water a day to operate. Semiconductor plants that fabricate the tiny components consume millions. Then there's the energy required to make it all run, something we think of only occasionally when the battery icon goes red and we anxiously search for an electrical outlet to get a charge. Sending an email, or even a simple smiley face over SMS, implicates a vast but largely overlooked planetary-wide system of non-renewable resources, manufacturing, shipping, energy, labor, and non-recyclable waste. These are all part of the hidden externalities of our growing communications ecosystem. They are sunk costs, not factored into the real costs of that email or smiley face. These costs do not show up in our monthly cell phone bills, no matter how outrageously expensive those may seem. But they are costs that we will reckon with down the road eventually, previews of which can be seen and felt now in a city like Delhi. There's nothing that quite embodies such internal contradictions as much as the virtuality, ephemerality, and endless novelty of our social media experiences on the one hand, and on the other hand, the raw materiality, astronomical origins, and ancient roots of the components that go into the devices that make it all run. It's hard to believe that something so new and polished as a consumer-level mobile device contains elements whose genesis reaches back billions of years. To understand the ecological footprint of our communications ecosystem requires us to go back to the most basic raw materials, the so-called rare earth elements and other minerals without which our appliances would not function. I've often thought how wonderful it would be if our devices had a list of ingredients in the way that packaged food items do. That might remind everyone of social media's intimate connection to the natural world. Much as canned ravioli has a combination of familiar ingredients, tomato, water, carrots, and obscure chemicals and other ingredients such as sodium phosphate, xanthan gum, carotenoid, lactic acid, so too do our handheld devices. There's silica and sand, which are the main ingredients of our glass display. There's tin, which is used as solder in the electrical circuitry. There are tiny traces of gold, silver, and copper distributed through the motherboard and wiring. A device's processor is made up mostly of silicon, but also includes phosphorus, antimony, arsenic, boron, indium, and gallium. And then there's a long list of so-called rare earth elements that are much more obscure: tantalum, terbium, yttrium, and more. In fact, around 70 of the 83 stable and non-radioactive elements in the entire periodic table can be found in a typical smartphone, including around 62 different types of metal. Our device's ingredient list would be a long one. And while some of them are employed in extremely tiny quantities, they all have to be dug up from the earth somewhere and then processed, shipped, and manufactured. Of these, rare earth elements are the most interesting for our purposes. Rare earth elements are not called rare because they are in short supply. In fact, they are plentiful. They are rare because they are hard to extract from the earth and separate from the other constitutive minerals with which they are found, at least without causing major ecological stresses. There are 17 rare earth elements, of which 16 are included in our handheld devices. These elements have extraordinary magnetic and conductive properties, which give life to many of the features we associate with our smartphones and tablets. For example, Terbium, yttrium, gadolinium, and europium are essential to the vivid colors we see on our display screens. Neodymium and praseodymium are used to help our devices vibrate. And these elements are not limited to just our handheld devices. They are essential ingredients of a wide range of other consumer and military-grade electronic appliances, from electric cars and other transportation technologies to LED displays on modern weapons systems. Most of the rare earth elements come from China, which occasionally makes for some interesting geopolitical dynamics. China's dominance of the rare earth metals market has led to some hand-wringing in American-based think tanks. If China were to cut off the elements, it could conceivably affect a broad range of electronic equipment critical to digital infrastructure across governments, business, research, healthcare, and other vital sectors. However rare earth elements end up used as a piece in the chess game of international security politics, and no matter where they end up being mined from and processed, a more salient factor is their impact on the natural world. Mining for rare earth elements can be highly toxic, both for surrounding and impacted ecosystems and for the labor force that works on the operations. Wherever there are mines in China, one finds high levels of contaminants in the region's ground and surface water. Long-term exposure to these chemicals causes major health risks for humans as well as wildlife. Nearby villagers report grotesque deformities in local livestock, including sheep that had developed 2 rows of teeth. Villagers who drank from local wells, where the water looked fine but smelled really bad, later reported blackened gums and teeth falling out. While improvements are being made across China to address the ecological consequences of rare earth and other mining, the damage for local communities has already been done and will take billions of dollars to repair, if repairs can be done at all. Surface tailing ponds where the rare earth element leaching takes place are dispersed across several regions in China, usually near river systems and other ground and surface water systems. A slight breach of these tailing ponds, caused by a landslide, for example, can affect the safe drinking water sources for tens of millions of people living in major population centers downstream. One of China's largest and longest-running rare earth mines is Bayan Obo, near the Inner Mongolian city of Baotou. As one BBC science journalist described it, Bayan Obo is the closest thing to, quote, hell on earth. One of the site's unmistakable features is an 11 square kilometer sludge waste pond, about 3 times as large as Vancouver's Stanley Park. The journalist described it as, quote, a truly alien environment, dystopian and horrifying, that made him both depressed and terrified, realizing, quote, this was the byproduct not just of the consumer electronics in my pocket, but also green technologies like wind turbines and electric cars that we get so smugly excited about in the West.
Hi, Tamsin Shaw here. I think it's really important that people recognize those unseen environmental costs because very few people know about them. Once you do, it makes it seem very ironic that there is so much tweeting and activism and online on all of the different platforms about climate change without people having an awareness of that. So you create an infrastructure that allows people to connect about it and to publicize those problems when in fact that infrastructure is exacerbating them. And I also wonder whether all of our online comments about that are actually a disincentive to taking other kinds of action. So the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote an essay on the theatre where he says that people will go to the theatre and see a tragedy and weep over it and feel that they're being extremely empathetic, and they'll feel that they've therefore discharged their duty to humanity in doing that, and they'll leave the theatre and feel as though something ethical has been accomplished when in fact it was all make-believe. So imagine that you're in that theater for many, many hours of your day, and that's what you're doing. Instead of taking any genuine action, we're all discussing a problem in a way that is, in a sense, make-believe, so long as it all stays online. That might actually be a disincentive to our taking action in the real world.
This is Meredith Whittaker. I think this is a profound passage, and it gets back to the difference between the dominant narrative that is told by tech companies and their marketing departments and their boosters, and the reality of what it actually means to produce and use and maintain these technologies, that there is a material cost and that there's a lot of hidden labor and hidden resources that go into creating these technologies. And I think this type of insight allows us to begin to question, who does this dominant narrative serve? Why is a story about two geniuses in a garage making dematerialized ephemeral technologies so much more useful to these companies than a story about lithium mines, about rare earth mineral mining, about the logistics chains that get those here, about manufacturers in different parts of the world linked by global supply chains, about the armies of contract labor, often in the global south, who are doing the work of content moderation and data labeling that is irreducibly necessary to maintain these platforms, all of which are erased under stories of singular, usually white male genius.
You're listening to the fifth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures, Burning Data by Ron Deibert. This is Ideas. In Canada on CBC Radio 1, on Sirius XM across North America, in Australia on RN, and around the world at cbc.ca/ideas. I'm Nala Ayed. It's looking as if the internet and social media have been taken over by extremists and bad actors. We've all been turned into addicts. Our personal data is being stolen and sold to the highest bidder. We're spied on and surveilled by foreign powers, and the phones and tablets we're all using are polluting the planet. On today's program, Ron Deibert takes us on a tour through the environmental degradation caused by our digital tools. There is no cloud, he reminds us. Every part of our communications ecosystem is inextricably connected to the natural world, taxing it at every point: mining, manufacturing, transportation, energy consumption, and waste. This is Burning Data, the fifth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures. Here's Ron Deibert.
Part 3. The Rare Earth Crisis. Rare earth elements, though critical, are not the only mineral components that go into our modern electronic appliances. Mining operations the world over are integral to the devices we take for granted, and are also linked to pollutants, labor troubles, kidnappings, smuggling, and even violent conflict. Take lithium, also known as gray gold, which is used to power an increasing number of electronics, from the batteries in mobile phones to those that power electric vehicles. Lithium production is booming and expected to grow even more in years to come. For example, a single Tesla car requires about 7 kilograms of lithium for each of its battery packs. Like rare earth elements, lithium is not in short supply. However, like rare earth elements, the lithium extraction process can involve techniques that cause environmental damage. As one author sardonically put it, lithium is, quote, what links the battery in your smartphone with a dead yak floating down a Tibetan river. Like the extraction of rare earth elements, mining for lithium involves energy-intensive and environmentally taxing processes. Lithium is found in the brine of salt flats. Holes are drilled into the salt flats and the brine is pumped to the surface, where it is left to evaporate in large ponds. The lithium carbonate is then extracted through a chemical process that, through spills, leaching, or air emissions, can harm nearby communities, water systems, wildlife, livestock, and farmland. Since lithium salt flats are usually located in arid territories, the mining process also diverts and puts a major strain on already thinly stretched water supplies. In Chile's Atacama and Argentina's Salar de Hombre Muerto regions, where lithium mining operations are located, local communities complain about water-related shortages and conflicts related to them, as well as contaminated water supplies. By far the most concerning mining operations are those in and around zones of conflict. Thanks to films like Blood Diamond and campaigns to regulate and eradicate trade in so-called conflict minerals, most people have a general appreciation that mining operations in places like Central Africa are bound up with warfare, organized crime, poor labor practices, smuggling, and kidnapping. But what may be overlooked is how the elements that are mined in these regions, such as cobalt, copper, tantalum, tin, and gold, are integral to the components that make up our electronic devices. More than half of the world's cobalt supply is sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that for decades was ravaged by civil war, the countryside littered with hundreds of armed groups that routinely terrorize about 4.5 million internally displaced people. Investigations undertaken by Amnesty International and others have shown that cobalt mining operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo routinely use child labor in mines that involve hand-dug tunnels, where work is extremely hazardous and accidents common. Says the Amnesty International report, quote, "Artisanal miners include children as young as 7, who scavenge for rocks containing cobalt in the discarded byproducts of industrial mines, and who wash and sort the ore before it is sold." The study found that workers were not outfitted with even the most basic health and safety equipment and worked in deep tunnels without proper ventilation. Respiratory and other health problems from exposure to toxic elements are common. Health officials have linked breathing problems and birth defects in local communities to exposure to toxic metals associated with the mining activities. A 2007 United States Agency for International Development study found that around 4,000 children worked at mining sites in the southern city of Kolwezi alone. Children were paid on average about $1 per day. One author put this wage in perspective. Quote, "A child working in a mine in the Congo would need more than 700,000 years of non-stop work to earn the same amount as a single day of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' income. All of this for a mere 5 to 10 grams of cobalt in the smartphone you hold in your hand. The same dynamic plays itself out around the globe, wherever the mining operations for the elements integral to our devices are located. Next time you casually swipe through your Facebook feed, try to pause for a moment and think about where the minuscule drops of solder that bind the electric circuitry inside your device are ultimately sourced and at what human and environmental cost. The basic rare earth elements that are the essential ingredients of our digital devices are at the far end of the supply chain. After they are dug up from the earth and extracted from surrounding waste, they must then be packed up and shipped off to other processing and manufacturing centers, many thousands of miles away. A typical smartphone could have tens of thousands of individual components sourced from hundreds of different companies that snake their way through a sprawling network of miners, smelters, traders, shippers, and manufacturers in dozens of different jurisdictions. Each step of the global electronic supply chain involves various forms of transportation and shipping, which are major contributors to CO2 emissions worldwide. The container ships that chug across the planet's oceans, lakes, and rivers, circulating the elements, components, and final consumer products that comprise our communications ecosystem, are among the worst environmental offenders. it is estimated that one container ship can produce the same amount of pollution as about 50 million cars, especially sulfur and carbon dioxide. Container ships also pollute the marine environment through release of ballast water, diesel fuel, human waste, and other garbage. Before they hit the market, our gadgets have to be assembled somewhere, usually immense assembly plants, where repetitive stress injuries, labor violations, and voluminous toxic effluents are common. In fact, the manufacturing of digital devices produces far more waste and pollution than consumer-disposed waste, which usually garners more attention since it touches most consumers directly. For example, in the European Union in 2014, 5 times more waste, around 16.2 million tons, was produced from electronics manufacturing than the volume of e-waste collected from households, which is about 3.1 million tons. As much as 4 times the amount of chemicals that actually end up in our devices is generated as waste in the manufacturing process. The manufacture of flat panel television and computer displays releases fluorinated greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, gases that the Environmental Protection Agency says have, quote, extremely high global warming potentials, with some persisting in the atmosphere for thousands of years, effectively causing irreversible impacts on the Earth's climate system. Geographer Josh Lepofsky, another researcher who has closely studied the topic, says that, together with mining, manufacturing processes account for about 95% of waste associated with digital technologies. That's 95% of waste before we even buy a phone.
It's John Norton here. For me, the big lesson is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. At the beginning, when we thought that this technology was all about weightless electrons flying around at the speed of light, then people couldn't imagine or didn't realize that, well, electricity is involved in all of this. And electricity has to be generated somehow, and computers generate heat, and that has to be dissipated somehow. Which is why, in the end, the giant server farms that we need in order to run our smartphones, they had to be located near good supplies of electricity, or in colder climates. But what took us even longer to appreciate, I think, is that some of the natural resources needed to build these wonderful smartphones and other devices, they also have to be extracted from the earth, and that those processes are often environmentally disastrous and very prejudicial to the human rights of the people who do the work. And it makes one realize that what drives the mania for changing your smartphone every year or two actually was an old idea. It was first discovered by General Motors way back in the 1950s. It's called planned obsolescence. And the environmental cost of that mania is actually much greater than we had ever realized. So the question to ask is this: do you really, really need that iPhone 12? Just because it has 5G?
This is Daniel Dudney again, jumping in. This is a story of resource extraction and exploitation of labor that is all too familiar to us, not just for the raw materials for the internet, but more generally. And this is actually one of the parts of this problem that I think can be most readily fixed. And all that we really have to happen is for the leaders, the main companies, to basically say, we're not going to buy this material unless we have authentication as to the labor and environmental conditions under which it was produced. They could do that, and it would turn things around right away. And the result would be that all of the environmental deterioration would subside, the labor exploitation would be greatly diminished, and the price to the consumer for the product would go up somewhat.
Part 4. Energy-sucking machines. Nowhere are the contradictions surrounding social media more pronounced than in the difference between how most of us perceive those media and the vast amounts of energy they actually consume. Streaming videos, FaceTime, and other video meetups seem almost like magic, insubstantial, weightless, virtual. Our digital experiences feel clean. We don't smell or taste what we consume online unless we fry our overheated electronics from excessive use. But they are far from that. The devices, appliances, cell towers, networks, and platforms that make up our communications ecosystem together draw enormous amounts of energy. Just look around your own house and count the number of electronic appliances you plug in. How many of them are always on? Some estimates say Americans waste up to $19 billion annually in electricity costs due to vampire appliances, digital devices that draw power even when they are turned off. Those numbers are set to rise substantially as the Internet of Things rolls out worldwide. Fridges, microwaves, home security systems, baby monitors, and more, all pulsating with continuous data streams, networked through our handheld devices. And that is just the beginning. Over half of the world's population is not yet connected to the Internet, but that is changing fast. It's difficult to measure the carbon emissions and overall energy consumption related to our communications ecosystem with precision, but it's fair to say they're large and growing. Prior to the global pandemic, I had seen references to estimates that place the Internet's energy and carbon footprints on a par with or even exceeding the airline industries. A study by the American Coal Association, strange, I know, estimated that a smartphone streaming an hour of video on a weekly basis uses more power annually than a new refrigerator. An email has an estimated carbon footprint of about 4 grams of CO2 emissions. An email with a large attachment as much as 50. Sending 65 emails is roughly equivalent to driving 1 kilometer in a car. Overall, the world's email usage roughly generates as much carbon dioxide as having an extra 7 million cars on the roads. It's become common to hear that, quote, data is the new oil, usually meaning that it's a valuable resource. Studies like these give the analogy an entirely different and disturbing connotation. While in Delhi, I spend several days following what I think of as the long hidden tail at the far end of the supply chain. What happens to all electronic equipment after it is no longer working? I meet up with Nilanjan Chaudhry, a senior producer in India's Al Jazeera office, and someone who has covered the topic locally. Our first stop is a shopping area near his offices in Delhi's Nehru Place neighborhood, which I can only describe as a kind of Blade Runner-style street bazaar. Crowds filter through a seemingly endless number of small shops and electronic stalls. There are people selling only pirated printer cartridges or motherboards. Others, nothing but replacement glass screens for damaged smartphones. Here and there are makeshift stands selling discounted SIM cards. There are dozens of repair shops lined up next to each other, each seemingly with its own specialty. It's loud and just a notch below chaotic. Shop owners barter with customers, mobile phones cradled between the shoulder and the ear, another 2 or 3 splayed out on the counter. This district is a way station of sorts, a kind of technological halfway house interposed between consumers and India's semi-regulated reuse, repair, and remanufacturing sector. From here, we make our way by car to Seelampur in northeast Delhi, the next and final step in the long tail at the end of the supply chain. To describe what I see in old Seelampur as something informal and unskilled would give the wrong impression. What I witness is in fact highly organized, segmented, and specialized, albeit in what amounts to septic conditions. Anything that can't be repaired in a reuse and remanufacturing center like Nehru Place is shipped here to be cannibalized back down to its most basic elements. Seemingly endless alleys are divided into nearly identical sized stalls, one after the other, each containing laborers specializing in their respective niche. I feel like I'm in one big open-air morgue, but for electronic instead of human corpses. There are many misconceptions about recycling and waste that I confront while in Delhi, including my own. Media coverage of e-waste brings to mind vast dumps of discarded computer monitors and motherboards being shipped from the affluent north to the impoverished global south. The reality is much more nuanced. What I see firsthand in Delhi is an extraordinary supply chain of a different sort. Not a single screw goes to waste, says Chowdhury as we pass by the old Seelampur stalls. Every single stall has a different specialty in this predominantly Muslim district. I pass by a man squatting in front of his stall on a mat, a large pile of small circuit boards spread out in front of him. Behind him are piles of what look to be the insides of discarded cell phones. He sits patiently with a screwdriver, carefully removing tiny components and then placing each component into neatly separated piles to his right. Buyers and sellers roam the mud-filled streets. Giant plastic bags are flung over the shoulders of transporters moving parts from one stall to another, where a different stripping process is performed by another family, as meticulous in its own way as the last. While India's reuse economy is truly remarkable, that doesn't mean there's no waste or other issues. The open sewers I tread gingerly around are the first clue. It's disconcerting to see that among the stalls are many small children and young adolescents pulling apart end-of-life electronic equipment, putting the leftover materials through acid washes, and burning circuit boards in the hopes of extracting precious metals like gold and silver, all with bare hands and without any protective equipment. Toxic waste is routinely dumped into open drains, which in turn leaches into the water table. Adding to the squalor, Old Seelampur is on a low-lying plain that is highly susceptible to annual flooding. Raw sewage, combined with acid wash from the e-waste dismantling processes, flows directly into the Yamuna River, its shores clogged with the largest accumulation of discarded plastic water bottles I've ever seen in my life. Putting aside the squalor and demoralizing child labor, there are many things to be learned from the Seelampur recycling district. For far too long, we have lived in a culture of disposable wealth and planned obsolescence. We have become accustomed to a regular turnover of our consumer electronics and don't give much thought to them once they no longer work. To be sure, some great strides have been made in recycling. Instead of simply discarding things, many of us now neatly separate our plastics, glass, paper products, and batteries and place them in blue bins. Companies have pledged to do better, thanks to pressure campaigns by environmental NGOs. For example, Apple has set a goal for itself to use 100% recycled components in the manufacturing of its iPhone and other consumer-level electronics. It has developed robots that can strip discarded iPhones for their material elements. The company now uses 100% recycled tin in the logic boards of its new iPhones. But Apple also strictly forbids and actively works against home repairs and has come under fire for artificially slowing down and degrading battery management features on older devices, presumably to encourage upgrades. Put simply, it is more profitable for companies like Apple to make products that are designed to die than it is to make products that last. Apple's contradictions are, in fact, our own. We live in a world of endless hyperconsumption and give little thought to the externalities produced by it all, from the energy-intensive and highly polluting mining and manufacturing to the energy that is required to power it all, and finally to all the waste that is squeezed out the other end. It's also good to remind ourselves that even highly efficient recycling is an energy-intensive industrial process. Stripping down discarded electronics to the valuable bits of copper, gold, cobalt, and other elements can entail a lot of machinery and labor, draw enormous energy, and produce huge volumes of waste. Jim Lynch, a recycling expert at the US-based nonprofit TechSoup Global, says adding extra life to computers saves between 5 and 20 times more energy than recycling them outright. To be sure, the philosophy of not a screw going wasted is one that could be helpfully duplicated the world over and used as a way to claw back some control over the platforms and companies that actively lobby against the right to repair, reuse, and remanufacture. But that's still just treating one symptom of a much bigger underlying disease. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us in a brutal way that we are intimately and inescapably tied to nature. Most of us are now familiar with the term Anthropocene, which refers to the human impacts on the natural environment, now reaching the point of existential risk due to the climate crisis. We have for too long lived in a virtual hallucination. The early promotion of the Wired Society trumpeted a lot that we now know was naive, such as the assumption that the internet and other technologies would democratize societies and eliminate power hierarchies. That turned out to be flat wrong. But there have also been long-standing myths about how digital technologies are weightless and atoms would be replaced by bits. The grimy, exhaust-filled industrial era would be overtaken by digital technologies that are clean, infinitely reusable, and virtual. We don't see the exhaust when we send that email because it's out of sight and out of mind. That device you hold in your hand is but a tiny manifestation of a vast and extended global supply chain, and the culmination of numerous labor-intensive, highly industrialized, energy-intensive, and environmentally damaging processes spread around the world. Each time you swipe, text, or search, in your own small way, you are contributing to a planet-wide syndrome that risks our very survival as a species.
You've been listening to Burning Data, the fifth of the 2020 CBC Massey Lectures by Ron Deibert. The entire lecture series will be on our website, cbc.ca/Masseys, and you can also download the podcasts from our podcast page. Your local or online bookseller will have the book of the lectures, Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, published by House of Anansi Press. And now that you've been listening to the lectures, we're inviting you to send us the questions you have for Ron Deibert. We'll be creating a special program to run with the rebroadcast of the series in March 2021. I'll be talking with Ron along with the guests you heard on the program, and we'll be discussing some of the questions you send us. So send your questions to masseyquestions@cbc.ca. That's masseyquestions@cbc.ca. Our partners in the Massey Lectures series are Massey College in the University of Toronto and House of Anansi Press. The Massey Lectures series is produced by Philip Coulter. Online production by Althea Madison, Andrew Nguyen, and Sinisha Jolich. Our web producer is Lisa Ayuso. Technical production, Danielle Duval. Senior producer, Nicola Luksic. The executive producer of the Massey Lectures and Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Nala Ayed.